Welcome to Chapter 12, entitled The Role of Core Outcome Sets for Pharmaceutical Care Research. The development and implementation of core outcome sets can help support the generation of high-quality evidence for pharmaceutical care research, which in turn can help improve outcomes for patients. The concept of COS is relatively new, and a robust, evidence-based methodology for developing and implementing core outcome sets is not yet fully established. The processes described in the COMET Handbook, version 1, represents what is known to be best practice at the time of publication. However, there remains some uncertainties regarding the impact of different methodological decisions made during the development of a core outcome set. For example, how to choose the best consensus technique, or how outcomes are prioritized for inclusion in a core outcome set. Furthermore, guidance regarding how to reduce the number of outcomes specified in a core outcome set to a number that can practicably be measured and reported in an RCT is needed. The handbook is likely to be updated periodically as more research is undertaken. A key message for core outcome set developers is to be transparent with regard to the methods used during core outcome set development studies. An accurate description of how and why key decisions during the core outcome set development process are made, and the outcome of those decisions, will not only encourage uptake of the developed COS, but will help guide the refinement of core outcome set development methodology. Next we will discuss core outcomes. The outcomes that are measured in trials are essential to determine the effectiveness of interventions in pharmaceutical care. These outcomes can be used to compare results between trials and subsequently form the basis of systematic reviews and meta-analysis. However, difficulties arise when trials examining similar interventions use different outcome measures. This has been highlighted across the literature, with one systematic review identifying 327 different outcomes used across 47 randomized controlled trials, RCTs, involving medication review in older people. This makes it impossible for interventions to be directly compared, and presents difficulties to policymakers and other stakeholders involved in decisions regarding funding interventions. Despite the strengths of RCTs in terms of experimental design, there is still the potential for bias to be introduced during the implementation and reporting phases. There are a number of types of bias which can be introduced within a study, collectively known as selective reporting bias. A subset of selective reporting bias specifically related to outcomes is outcome reporting bias, which occurs when only the statistically significant outcomes are reported in the final results, despite the authors stating other outcomes were measured in the methodology or study protocol. This will have an important impact on interventions, affecting the validity of systematic reviews and meta-analysis aiming to determine their effectiveness, which will subsequently hinder an evidence-based approach to choosing healthcare interventions. One approach to overcoming these challenges is through the development and implementation of core outcome sets, abbreviated as COS, defined as the minimum set of outcomes to be measured in all trials conducted in a particular area of health. Whilst not intended to be the only outcomes measured, they form a standard list of the minimum outcomes which should be reported in such trials, which in turn will facilitate comparison between studies and ultimately reduce bias. The development of core outcome sets has been endorsed by the Core Outcome Measures in Effectiveness Trials, abbreviated as COMET, initiative. This chapter will introduce the Core Outcome Measures in Effectiveness Trials initiative, detail the methodology employed to develop a core outcome set, and describe other core outcome set initiatives which support core outcome set development. At the end of the chapter, Case studies of recent core outcome sets developed in pharmaceutical care will also be presented. We will now discuss COMET initiative. The COMET initiative provides support by providing resources, networking opportunities and training for core outcome set developers. Specific objectives of the COMET initiative are to raise the awareness of current problems with outcome selection in clinical trials, encourage evidence-based core outcome set development and uptake, promote patient and public involvement, abbreviated as PPI, and prevent duplication of effort in core outcome set development studies. To facilitate these aims, the COMET initiative provides a range of resources for use by core outcome set developers. Examples include plain language summaries that describe the core outcome set development process to patients and the public, guidance on the implementation of a core outcome set, and exemplar core outcome set development protocols. An online database of all ongoing and published core outcome set studies is maintained by the COMET initiative, available from www.comet-initiative.org, to share examples of good practice and avoid duplication of effort. The searchable database was launched in August 2011, and contains 897 references of planned, ongoing and completed core outcome set development studies, correct as of July 2017. Recently added studies include the development of a core outcome set for immunomodulation in pregnancy and one for effectiveness trials investigating Perthes disease of the hip. Prospective core outcome set developers can use the database to determine if relevant work has already been undertaken in specific clinical areas. Likewise, researchers planning trials of interventions can search the database for the existence of a core outcome set that is applicable to the clinical area under investigation. Some funding bodies, such as the National Institute for Health Research, abbreviated as NIHR, in the United Kingdom, now recommend that researchers use the COMET database to identify relevant core outcome sets when preparing funding applications. The COMET Handbook contains information and guidance about the development, implementation, evaluation and updating of a core outcome set. The first version of the handbook was published in June 2017. Next we will discuss the methodology. The COMET Handbook outlines in detail the recommended process for developing a core outcome set, the steps of which are summarized in Figure 12.1. Key aspects in core outcome set development methodology include defining the scope of the core outcome set, identifying existing knowledge, involving key stakeholders and achieving consensus on the outcomes to be included in the final core outcome set. Next we will discuss defining the scope of a proposed core outcome set. The scope of a core outcome set indicates the specific area of research to which the core outcome set is to be applied. This scope of the core outcome set, in terms of specificity, should be considered alongside the relative size of the research area concerned. The scope should therefore be described in terms of the target population, applicable setting or settings and relevant study intervention or interventions that the core outcome set will relate to. Figure 12.2. As discussed in Section 12.1, known challenges relating to heterogeneity of outcome measurement and reporting of outcomes across trials in a specific area will justify the need for a relevant core outcome set to be developed. Once the need for a core outcome set has been established and the scope proposed, it is vital to identify if studies have already been undertaken, or are currently underway, to develop a core outcome set with the same or similar scope. The COMET Initiative's online searchable database, see Section 12.2, can be used to identify existing or ongoing work prior to proceeding with a new core outcome set study. For this reason, core outcome set developers should therefore make early contact with COMET to register their ongoing core outcome set project. COMET also encourages researchers to develop and make publicly available a study protocol, either via the COMET database entry or a publication in an open access journal. Pause the video and carefully scrutinize Figure 12.1 illustrating the core outcome set development process before advancing to the next slide. Pause the video and carefully scrutinize Figure 12.2 illustrating considerations for the scope of a core outcome set before advancing to the next slide. And now we will look at identifying potential outcomes for inclusion in the core outcome set. A review of previous trials or systematic reviews, relevant to the proposed scope, is the main method of identifying a list of outcomes for consideration for inclusion in the core outcome set. If required, a review of relevant studies that are not necessarily effectiveness trials, e.g., observational studies and qualitative studies, may also be useful in identifying potential outcomes. There is no recommended time frame within which to review the published literature. Therefore, the approach should be pragmatic and guided by the scope of the core outcome set and the size of the body of associated published literature. As large reviews are resource-intensive, one strategy could be to perform the literature review in stages, starting with the most recently published studies, until outcome saturation is achieved, i.e., no additional outcomes are being identified. Next, we will consider categorizing identified outcomes. It is likely that many identified outcomes could be considered as equal to one other, albeit reported using a range of terminologies across different studies. Such outcomes can therefore be categorized into one descriptive term. Core outcome set developers may also choose to group related outcomes into outcome domains, i.e., constructs which can be used to classify several outcomes. Such categorization of outcomes should ideally be conducted independently by at least two researchers. Next, we will discuss stakeholder involvement. A core outcome set should contain outcomes considered important not only by researchers, but by relevant stakeholders, including patients and carers. Other key stakeholder groups may include healthcare professionals, regulators, and patient charities or support groups. Stakeholders may be involved in one or more stages of core outcome set development, i.e., stakeholders' opinions may be sought to identify outcomes of importance in the initial stage, thus filling potential knowledge gaps as a result of using only published research to identify outcomes. Stakeholders may also participate in a consensus exercise to determine the final core outcome set. See later. Decisions regarding the extent of stakeholder involvement, the groups of stakeholders to be involved, and the number and proportion from each group will be dependent upon the particular scope of the core outcome set as well as feasibility considerations. Core outcome set developers should ideally strive to include stakeholders from across a range of countries to help ensure the widespread relevance and adoption of the core outcome set. Furthermore, involving public research partners in both the design and oversight of the core outcomes set development study can be beneficial in accessing particular patient populations and facilitating the design of more appropriate study information, e.g., patient information leaflets. Patient and carer stakeholders may, for example, be identified and recruited via clinics, charity organizations, advocacy groups, and carers support groups. Qualitative methods, such as focus groups, may be used to identify outcomes that are important to patients and carers. Qualitative research methodologies are an accessible way for patients and carers to be involved in core outcome set development, as they have the opportunity to explain important aspects of their experiences in their own terms, without the need for them to engage with research-centric language involving outcomes and core outcome sets. Next, we will discuss consensus exercise. Having identified a long list of potential outcomes, achieving consensus on the important core outcomes is the crucial final step in the core outcome set development process. Whilst a variety of methods exist to elicit consensus, the most frequently used technique in core outcome set development is the Delphi technique, which comprises sequential rounds of questionnaires through which the anonymous opinions of participants are sought on the importance of the listed outcomes, indicated by a score. Following each round, the collated group scores are fed back to the participants. As the participants do not directly interact with each other, the risk of an individual being overly influential or dominant in the group consensus process is reduced. Furthermore, core outcome set studies typically use a modified, rather than a traditional Delphi technique. In a traditional Delphi exercise, the outcomes of potential importance would be identified in the first round of the Delphi by participants through the use of an open text question. In the modified Delphi exercise, the participants are presented with the long list of outcomes that have been identified as described previously. However, COMET recommends that Delphi participants should be given the opportunity in the survey to propose additional outcomes not identified in the literature or via stakeholder involvement. Whilst there is no recommendation for the ideal number of participants to be included in a Delphi panel, it is important to acknowledge that patients, healthcare professionals and researchers may have differing opinions on which outcomes they consider most important. Therefore, careful consideration must be given in advance to the composition of the stakeholder groups within the Delphi panel. And now let's look at the criteria for consensus. In core outcome set development studies, Delphi survey participants are commonly asked to score each listed outcome using the grading of recommendations assessment, development and evaluation, abbreviated as GRADE, group scoring system, where a score of 1 to 3 signifies an outcome of limited importance, 4 to 6, important, but not critical, and 7 to 9, critical. Consensus regarding whether an outcome is to be included in the core outcomes set is often defined as 70% or more of the respondents scoring an outcome between 7 and 9 and fewer than 15% scoring it as 1 to 3. Conversely, consensus that an outcome should not be included in the COS is typically defined as 70% or more scoring it as 1 to 3 and fewer than 15% scoring it as 7 to 9. Any other scores would typically be classified as no consensus, and therefore the outcome would not be included in the core outcome set. We will now consider face-to-face meeting. COMET recommends that, following the Delphi exercise, core outcomes set developers hold a face-to-face meeting with stakeholders with the aim of achieving a final consensus on the outcomes to be included in the core outcome set through discussion of the Delphi results and voting, if necessary. Such meetings may involve a heterogeneous group of stakeholders including patients, or alternatively, separate meetings for healthcare professionals and patients may be conducted. Consideration must also be given to the number and proportion of individuals from each stakeholder group. Other issues to consider with face-to-face meetings, as well as other aspects of core outcome set development methodology in general, are discussed in greater detail in the COMET Handbook. Next we will discuss other core outcome set initiatives. The above sections describe the COMET initiative and outline the recommended methodology as set out by the recently published COMET Handbook, version 1. Within the handbook, 2 additional initiatives: Core Outcomes Set Standards for Reporting, abbreviated as COS-STAR, and Consensus-Based Standards for the Selection of Health Measurement Instruments, abbreviated as COSMIN, are recommended to Core Outcomes Set developers to provide guidance with regard to the reporting of Core Outcomes Set studies and selection of measurement tools for outcomes. And now we will consider Core Outcomes Set Standards for Reporting, abbreviated as COS-STAR. Even when robust methodologies, as outlined above, are followed in the development of a core outcomes set, inconsistent reporting quality could result in the poor implementation of relevant core outcome sets. The need for clear and transparent presentation of the methods used during the development of core outcome sets was first highlighted by the COMET initiative in 2012. Indeed, a recent qualitative study involving core outcomes set developers concluded that reporting guidance would be of benefit to future core outcomes set developers. To encourage core outcomes set developers to improve the quality of published core outcome sets, the Core Outcomes Set Standards for Reporting, abbreviated as COS-STAR, guideline has been developed. Additionally, within the 4-step COS development process laid out in the COMET Handbook, version 1, the final step recommends that COS developers report their work using the COS-STAR guidance, as shown figure 12.1. The COS-STAR statement, developed by an international group including COS developers and potential core outcomes set users, includes an 18-item checklist, highlighting important methodological aspects of the core outcomes set development, e.g., scope, participants and outcome scoring, that should be reported in all core outcomes set studies, irrespective of the underlying methods or participants involved. The checklist is also supplemented by an explanation and elaboration document that outlines the need for each checklist item and examples of how each item has been reported properly in published studies. It is, however, important to note that the use of the COS-STAR checklist is not an indication of methodological quality and should not be used as a quality assessment tool. Core outcomes set developers should endeavor to follow methodological guidance set out by the COMET initiative and include reference to all the relevant checklist items when reporting their work. Next we will discuss consensus-based standards for the selection of health measurement instruments, abbreviated as COSMIN. The methodology proposed by the COMET initiative aims to determine what should be measured, as opposed to how it should be measured. A joint initiative between COMET and COSMIN was established to address this by developing a guideline on how to select outcome measurement instruments for outcomes included in a core outcome set. Furthermore, within the 4-step core outcomes set development process laid out in the COMET Handbook, an additional 5th step recommends that COS developers determine how to measure the core outcome set, including identifying existing measurement instruments and quality assessment, as shown in figure 12.1. The checklist focuses on assessing the measurement properties and methodological quality of health-related patient-reported outcomes, abbreviated as HR-PROs. However, the measurement properties evaluated are likely to be relevant for other non-PRO measurements instruments, with work currently underway to establish a checklist for these instruments. The 4-step process includes 1. Conceptual considerations, i.e., considerations include the construct, i.e., outcome or domain, to be measured and the target population, e.g., age, gender, disease characteristics. 2. Finding existing outcome measurement instruments. 3. Quality assessment of outcome measurement instruments. And 4. Generic recommendations on the selection of outcome measurement instruments for outcomes included in a core outcomes set. The COSMIN website also contains a database of systematic reviews of outcome measurement instruments that should be reviewed in Step 2, to determine what measurement instruments are currently available for each outcome included in a core outcome set. Step 3 involves using the COSMIN checklist to assess the quality of the outcome measurement instruments, in terms of the statistical methods used and the methodological properties based on the COSMIN taxonomy, e.g., internal consistency, reliability, measurement error, content validity, including face validity, construct validity, including structural validity, hypotheses testing and cross-cultural validity, criterion validity, responsiveness and interpretability, which are assessed against certain quality standards and rated on a 4-point scale: 1 equals poor, 2 equals fair, 3 equals good, or 4 equals excellent. This should result in the selection of only one outcome measurement instrument for each outcome in a core outcome set. Next we will look at core outcome sets developed or under development in pharmaceutical care. Case studies. Let's focus on the development of a COS for effectiveness trials aimed at optimizing prescribing in older adults in care homes. This core outcome set was developed as part of the Care Homes Independent Pharmacist Prescribing Study, abbreviated as CHIPS. A long list of outcomes was identified through both a review of published literature in the area, and stakeholder focus groups with GPs, pharmacists, care home staff, residents and relatives. Outcomes were reviewed and refined prior to entering a 2-round online Delphi exercise and then distributed via a web link to the Delphi panel, a multidisciplinary team including pharmacists, doctors and PPI representatives. Following both rounds of the Delphi exercise, 13 outcomes, organized into 7 overarching domains: medication appropriateness, adverse drug events, prescribing errors, falls, quality of life, all-cause mortality and admissions to hospital, and associated costs, met the criteria for inclusion in the final core outcome set. Next we will consider the development of a core outcome set for medication review in older people. The aim of this ongoing study is to develop a core outcomes set for medication review in older adults. A systematic review has been conducted to identify outcomes used in RCTs and prospective studies, which identified 327 different outcomes across 47 published RCTs as well as 248 outcomes across 32 published protocols. The large number of outcomes identified by this systematic review reinforced the need for a core outcome set in this area. Further work to develop the core outcome set will include interviews with patients over the age of 65 taking 5 or more medicines, along with their carers. The final stage will involve condensing outcomes into the final core outcomes set through 3 rounds of Delphi questionnaires, distributed to patients, carers, healthcare professionals and researchers across 4 European centers: Belgium, Ireland, Netherlands and Switzerland. Next we will look at the development of a core outcomes set for use in interventions aimed at improving appropriate polypharmacy in older people in primary care. The aim of this study was to develop a core outcomes set that can be applied to trials investigating the effectiveness of interventions targeting polypharmacy in older people in primary care. Phase 1 involved 3 steps. 1. Identifying outcomes used in previous studies by updating a Cochrane systematic review on interventions to improve appropriate polypharmacy in older people. 2. Identifying outcomes from previously collected qualitative data and 3. initial screening of outcomes from Steps 1 and 2, by the Project Steering Group. Phase 2 involved conducting a Delphi consensus exercise with key stakeholders, to reach consensus regarding which outcomes should be included in the core outcome set. The consensus exercise encompassed 3 rounds of online Delphi questionnaires with key stakeholders, an international panel of 160 stakeholders, including 120 experts, and a public participant panel of 40 older people. 29 outcomes identified from the Cochrane Review and existing qualitative data were included in a Delphi exercise. After 3 rounds of Delphi questionnaires, the final core outcome set comprised 16 outcomes, across 6 overarching themes. The 7 highest-ranked outcomes were serious adverse drug reactions, medication appropriateness, falls, medication regimen complexity, quality of life, mortality, and medication side effects. And now let's look at the development of a core outcome set for medicines management interventions for people with dementia living in primary care. The aim of this study was to develop a core outcome set for medicines management interventions for people with dementia living in primary care. The first phase of this project involved a systematic review of the literature, to identify outcomes currently used in RCTs in this area. The second phase involved semi-structured interviews with people with dementia, their carers, general practitioners and community pharmacists to identify which outcomes they felt were important. The final phase involved condensing the outcomes identified from the systematic review and semi-structured interviews into the final core outcome set. This was achieved through 3 rounds of Delphi questionnaires, distributed to healthcare professionals and researchers from a range of countries. Consensus for inclusion in the core outcome set was reached on 21 outcomes, out of 33 presented outcomes. Finally, we will discuss the development of a core outcome set for trials investigating the long-term management of bronchiectasis. A study that aimed to develop a core outcome set for trials investigating interventions for the long-term management of bronchiectasis has been completed. The study utilized the findings of existing research on outcome selection to compile a list of outcomes for consideration by a Delphi panel. An overview of Cochrane systematic reviews provided a list of outcomes that other researchers deemed important to measure when investigating interventions for bronchiectasis interventions. In a consultation with stakeholders, patients, healthcare professionals and academics, in the management of bronchiectasis, conducted as part of an ongoing study to develop an adherence intervention for the condition, expert panel members were asked to suggest and discuss outcomes they believed should be measured in an evaluation of the proposed intervention. Review of both these studies led to the identification of 20 outcomes for consideration by a Delphi panel in a consensus exercise. 86 participants from 22 European countries were recruited into the Delphi panel. The success of the recruitment strategy was largely attributable to the support provided by a European bronchiectasis network of healthcare professionals and a patient advisory group for bronchiectasis, coordinated by the European Lung Foundation. The Delphi panel rated the importance of each outcome from 1 to 9 in a series of 3 sequential online questionnaires using the grade criteria. See section 12.3.6. In the first questionnaire, participants were asked to suggest outcomes for consideration in subsequent questionnaires. Outcomes that were rated critical by 70% of the Delphi panel, and of limited importance by less than 15%, were added to the core outcome set. 82 participants responded to the first questionnaire. That is 42 doctors, 8 nurses, 10 physiotherapists, and 22 patients. Response rate 95%. Attrition in response rates between each questionnaire was 5%. 20 outcomes were rated in the first questionnaire, 32 in the second and 17 in the third. 18 outcomes exceeded the predefined threshold for consensus and were included in the core outcome set. Thank you.